Alright. Welcome to today's episode of how to kind of build the 10th Cavalry Brigade. Now this unit can really replace your howitzer. It is for 50 points. The light anti-tank gun is the same cost. The Bofors 37mm anti-tank gun was very effective for its time. Great against anything the Germans would throw at the Polish, especially considering most of their army, tank-wise, was Panzer Is and Is. Maybe a couple Czech tanks, relatively few 3s and 4s. But even the 3s and 4s were often light armored. They weren't the regular, what you'd expect to be heavy armored, right? So mostly 8+ armor. Now, the only difference really is when you look at the difference between the transport for it, because the transport for the howitzer is a 44-point half-track, whereas the transport here for the light anti-tank gun is only 25 points. So it's actually a little bit cheaper if you want to actually transport it with the tow. But this is just as good. It is an option. In my recommendation, you really need to determine from the opponents that you play in your group and the format, which of the two is better, the howitzer or the anti-tank gun. Now, if you get a lot of opponents running around with 9+ armor, then you probably want to go with this loadout. But if you're running combat patrols or most of your opponents are using 8+ armor or less, stick with the howitzer. You have a chance of doing more pins. You don't have to worry about the range. You still get +2. You're going to glance on front armor, pen potentially on side armor. So you got I think a lot more potential with the howitzer, given that it can affect infantry and artillery. Sorry, infantry and tanks. But if you really need to deal with your opponent's tanks, you can't go wrong with the Bofors. So, your choice, you're looking at, again, we ended the last video, we were looking at just under 1,000 points veteran with all of the vehicles, all the infantry, but the vehicles and artillery would be regular. You'd end up with just over 900 points. So this would be just under 900 points if you swap the AT gun in with the tow, as opposed to the howitzer with its tow. Okay. I have one other suggestion though, and this is why my collection doesn't necessarily have all the models for my anti-tank guns. When they introduced the Campaign of France book, they introduced a generic anti-tank gun platoon. So if you want to go with a dual platoon force without doing 2 infantry platoons, you could go with 3 anti-tank guns. So let's take a look at that. Alright, so here is a fully mobile anti-tank platoon. Now when you look at it, you have, according to the raw selector, you have the lieutenant, and you might as well go with a second lieutenant. However, if you do go with a first lieutenant, you can actually get 2 of your anti-tank guns to fire in one turn. It's with a snap 2 action, with basically 1 pull. However, you've got the required 2 anti-tank guns, and the third one is just an additional one with, and in this case I got 3 tows. Now, this is kind of an important approach that I'm talking about here. Again, remember, we're trying to look at the historical brigade and how it fielded its units. There are 2 places you'd find anti-tank guns. One was the anti-tank battalion, and one was, or actually it was a company, and one was within each regiment you had an anti-tank platoon. So the 10th the 10th Mounted Rifles and the 24th Uhlans each had an anti-tank gun battery, which was 3 anti-tank guns towed with the 302s, and of course with an officer leading it. That's why you see 3 anti-tank guns and not just 2. Now, in the actual company, and a tank company, there were 3 platoons of 3 guns each, total of 9. Now, when they were deployed as a unit. They weren't deployed piecemeal. So you could take this approach, very reasonably. Of course, you can also just, throw one anti-tank gun down in your regular platoon if you want. But this is actually a pretty cheap way to get a lot of anti-tank and still increase the size of your force pretty well. If these were all to be regular, so regular second lieutenant, first lieutenant and assistant. Oh, actually, I didn't bother putting an assistant down, but we'll go ahead and do exactly that because he's going to be an NCO. Oh, he could be a private as well, but kind of like the deputy platoon leader. So, again, black jacket. And then you'd have the 3 guns, each at 50 points regular, and then each of the 3 trucks or tows at 25 points apiece. So you have a grand total. You know what? There's one more thing you probably would need to, again, have a fully mobile force here, and that is giving the officer his own ride. So you would go ahead and give him his own 508. And that's 21 points. It's actually a utility car is the best profile to use because this is essentially just a Jeep. It isn't a recon unit, so you shouldn't use the Germany Strikes book with the 508 Wazik because the Wazik is a recce. It's considered to be the reconnaissance Jeep, which is entirely legitimate, but not in this case. So they would use the 508 Jeep, regular Jeep, which is best represented by the utility car. That's 21 points. So you have a grand total of what you see here of 331 points if it's regular, and if it's everything's vet except the transport or tows, it's 379. That's a pretty substantial point addition with a lot of power behind it. Now again, you're dealing with going up against armor. Your buddies take 9+ armor a lot, and you want to play your early war poles. Having the first lieutenant will allow you to snap 2, activating him and activating 2 of the 3 units to fire on the same enemy tank, putting potentially 2 pins and maybe even knocking it out with 1 order draw, right? So you can get the jump on them. That's one thing I would consider doing. I do like the idea of that. Now, unfortunately, there are no models available for the 10th Cavalry Brigade's anti-tank gun. So what I've got here is a Warlord anti-tank gun and a Hedgehog Historicals anti-tank gun, both of which came with regular infantry models. Okay, so what I had to do is I used a combination of models. Since I'm not using my howitzer in this particular build, I have my team from the howitzer, which is essentially these 3 models. Okay, what I've added to it is the mortarman that I happen to have. Since I've got 2 mortars and 2 medium machine gun teams, I went ahead, if I happen to have one of each of those in my list, I took the extra mortarmen and put them in the crew. And of course, these are more of the, these units here, or models here, are all from, and including this one, from Gorgon Studios. They are actually built from the support weapon platoon group, which is 4 models. It has an anti-tank rifle, and then basically a mortar, light mortar, then 2 other assistants, right? So you can actually use 3 of those models to create the additional units or models. Now what I've done is I didn't bother extending his coat with green stuff. I went ahead and painted him up as if he was a non-NCO. This one I actually did add green stuff to make his look a little longer. And you actually, if you compare these two, he's got the great coat, he has the black jacket. So that way I can have an NCO in each of the teams, actually make it visible. Not that there's an NCO in the actual unit for bolt action, but just from looks, okay? So I had to basically buy models from 3 different companies to get this effect. Not the greatest, but that's kind of how I did it. And that's why when you saw my initial overview of the Army, 2 of the guns didn't have anybody, and 2 did, because the extra guys were sitting around in the machine gun team and the mortar team and the 75mm howitzer, so they were spread around. Now you can add, according to the selector, a couple infantry squads, so that would also be appropriate because the company would also have technical staff, logistics staff, supply, all that, and so those men can be gathered together and create a rifle section, because in reality, in several of the engagements, especially toward the latter half of the second week, if you will, of the invasion, Maciek was kind of forced to bring all of the clerks, the supply and technical staff, and anybody who could carry a rifle in as a rifleman to help support and defend the positions, especially supporting the anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons. So it makes perfect sense to take the generic anti-tank gun platoon and add in a couple extra squads of just rifles. Now, it is, if you take a look at the table of organization equipment, you will also be able to add BARs to those. You don't necessarily need to, because again, you've got those in your other platoon. Just a suggestion. Alright, so there's kind of how to round out your force. You either swap out your one howitzer with an anti-tank gun, lower the cost just a bit, or go ahead with the full anti-tank platoon. And this is what it would look like on the field if it was actually, if you used the table organization equipment. Now, to all those who, I'm going to mention here, and I'll mention in the next video, to all of those who kind of talk down about and dismiss the table organization equipment. When you look at the Polish Army in 1939, it was not an extended campaign, unfortunately. The reality was, especially for this brigade and its actual combats, or the 2 weeks it was engaged, it actually followed its table organization equipment. So what it was supposed to have, it actually had. And that's how the units were created and built and established. Now, of course, as you have attrition, you start having units merge together, units getting smaller, getting larger, depending on who was available. So you can end up with maybe, do a 10-man squad, even though the table only has really 6 to 8. Casualties would require additional. But it's in the spirit of the table of organization equipment and the spirit of the history that of the 10th Cavalry Brigade actually experienced to go about this approach. I think it's a good one. Unlike a lot of other parts of the World War II, you didn't have you had a lot of situations where the table of organization equipment didn't really wasn't really followed, either because equipment was lost or equipment was creatively acquired to add to their units. So, but here we can kind of stick with it. Table organization equipment as a guide to how we should field the 10th Cavalry Brigade. Right now, we're sitting at essentially just over 1,300 points, maybe close to 1,400 points, if we go with the artillery with a tow in the regular infantry platoon and then this platoon here. Not necessarily the greatest approach, but we'll talk more on other approaches next time. All right, hope this was useful for you. Share, like, subscribe. We'll see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.